Welcome to the Gathering Podcast. This is episode number 10. We have a very special guest this week. His name is Jason Goins. He is the lead pastor for Renaissance Road Church in Jamestown, North Carolina. Pastor Jason left his job as a partner in one of the largest law firms in the state of North Carolina to start and pastor Renaissance Road Church in the year of 2008. In this episode of the Gathering Podcast, we get in a conversation with Jason about his experience as a lawyer and also as pastor and how those two professions have, in a way, interact in his approach to the ministry. And also, we talk about the upcoming revival that we all believe is soon to come to the Triad area. And also, we talk about the Renaissance Fellowship, a new exciting project that Pastor Jason is implementing and how that is related to the upcoming revival and also to the millennial generation. Also, we had the great privilege of having my pastor, Randall Reece from Hope Church in High Point, North Carolina, joining the conversation. He gave us great insights on church growth and church planting, and also shared his thoughts about Jason's project and Renaissance Fellowship. With no further ado, I give you Pastor Jason Goins. So one of the things that when I read your story, I was very fascinated by it because I went to law school.
Really?
In my younger years in Guatemala. And my sister is a lawyer. She's a full-time lawyer, and it's amazing because she can be right now prophesying you in the name of Jesus, and then 5 minutes later she goes into full lawyer mode, and I see her in action doing both, and it's amazing how that works. And I know a lot of my friends who are in the ministry who are lawyers or were lawyers, and now they're in the ministry, whether as pastors, evangelists. Mm-hmm. What do you think? There is something about God calling lawyers into the ministry, because you obviously grew up as, you choose that career and you were good at it, but then the Lord called you.
Yeah, so I would say at least 3 times a week I get a double take when somebody hears that I'm a lawyer and a pastor. Like the two things don't work together. Yeah. There are some lawyers who are, a lot of lawyers who abuse their position and their privilege, but you give anybody power and it brings out the worst in them. Power magnifies our defects, our weaknesses. For me, I was 28 years old. I was a youth pastor in Pastor Randall's church, and I was working 70 hours a week at one of the largest law firms in the state. I was about to become a partner. I became the youngest partner in that firm, and I had my future set. I could basically just sit back and watch the money roll in. But I was absolutely miserable, just because I felt like something was missing. Full bank account doesn't equal happiness, of course. Yeah. We all know that. It's easy to say that when you don't have a full bank account, but when you got a full bank account and you're still miserable, it's like, what am I doing wrong here? And I read this book by a guy named Craig Groeschel called Call Zone. Changed my life. Amazing book. If you're feeling empty in your life, you should check it out. But the word Call Zone means purpose. Hebrew word for purpose. It's when Proverbs 29 says, where there is no vision, the people perish. It's where there is no call zone, the people perish. And basically, it's this idea, the word picture there is of call zone is there's a bullseye for your life. And I was hitting the bullseye with my life. It's just the wrong target. I was aiming at the complete wrong target. And I think that's part of the problem, not just with people who are called into ministry, but with our generation, is that we work a job to make money, and we fall into whatever we fall into, and we very rarely ask, well, what does God want me to do?
Right.
What is God calling me to? And I realized I'm aiming at the wrong target. And and so I read that book, and probably a month later, I was talking to Pastor Randall here and the core team of the church I would be starting. And when I finally jumped into my call zone, my purpose, and it wasn't even that I was a pastor of a church, because that would come, 18 months later. But just knowing that I was moving into it changed everything. There's something about being in line with God's vision, heading in the right direction, that brings joy to you. So now you ask why lawyers are, I think a lot of times lawyers are often really super talented people, and talented people, smart people, get corralled into those kind of jobs. You need to be a doctor, you need to be a lawyer. And so there's this pressure on you from like grade school on of this is what greatness is, that you got to take on one of these professions. You're going to be a CEO or, some kind of professional. And then you do that your whole life, you work towards that, and you get there and you realize this isn't what I thought it would be. Yeah. So I think I would suspect that it's not just lawyers, but I think a lot of people who work towards the accolades get them and realize this is hollow. And so I think that's what's going on.
So I want to know, do you have any good lawyer jokes?
I should write a coffee table book on all the lawyer jokes that I have heard in my life.
We can all use one every now and then.
We could all use, but it's good to be able to make fun of yourself too. Don't take yourself too seriously.
When I see, for instance, the life of Moses, he was called to be the deliverer for the children of Israel. And he, by the divine providence, becomes a prince of Egypt. He grows in Pharaoh's house. For some reason, that upbringing that he had kind of molded him into, he kind of knew that he had a calling to liberate the people of Israel. And actually, when he was 40 years old, he tried to defend one of his brethren, and he got cast out of he had to flee. So he kind of knew that he was onto something, but at the same time, it was not the right timing. The question, what I asked you earlier, also, I'm trying to get to, what do you think as a lawyer that God has shown you that you have used in your leadership as pastor, a church planter now, as entrepreneur?
So I was a trial lawyer, which meant that I was a professional fighter. And so that's a very toxic environment because, it changed me. When I was 25, I got out of law school, my first day on the job. I'm a 25-year-old kid. I don't know anything about the business world, and I've got a multi-millionaire 60-year-old on the phone crying to me because he's about to lose everything in a lawsuit, you know? And so that's the world I was thrown into. And, you fight with people long enough, it changes you. And so that's part of the lack of fulfillment. I'm using what God has given me to do a thing that is toxic in a lot of ways. And, you bring that home. You fight for a living, you bring it home, and, my wife can fight better than I can, so I'd always lose at home, but for me, I learned how to see conflict from all angles.
Okay.
So you see enough conflict, you realize in every conflict, a few things. Everybody thinks they're right. Every time. Like, have you ever been in a conflict where you thought you were wrong? No.
Yeah.
You always think you're right. That's why you're in conflict. So everybody thinks that they are more right than they usually are. And I also learned almost always the truth is somewhere in the middle. And so, that helped me a lot. I was able to, and so in pastoring, you go from dealing with conflict in the professional world to dealing with conflict among your sheep. And of course, you get people together. There's going to be conflict all the time. And so for me, it was a crash course, a long crash course actually, in being able to shepherd your folks through conflict, and shepherd your leaders through conflict. One of the things that I didn't think about in starting the church is I knew church people would be a problem. It's hard to deal with church people, but conflict among your leadership. I mean, and in our church anyway, the most serious conflict hasn't been in our people who sit in the audience. Yeah. It's been in our leaders who care about the church more than anybody. And so people who are passionate, of course, they're going to have conflict. We've been very fortunate. Most of our core leaders who started our church with us, like 90% of them, are still with us. That's amazing.
Wow.
We have not had
very unusual.
Yeah. We've got some faithful people who have some faithful leaders who have overlooked a lot of mistakes on my part. But we've been able to steer free of, knock on wood, church splits through 11 years. God's. I think being a lawyer has really helped in that, and being able to steer people through conflict. So,
that's good. I ask you because seeing my sister literally switching hats in a moment from that, I thought, well, there is something to this profession, that the way you handle conflict specifically. You have to understand. There is a knowledge about human nature. And the Bible says that Jesus knew that everybody came to Jesus, and Jesus didn't trust people because he knew what was in the heart of man. So it's not that we want to be cynical about people, but understand that, in every situation, there's always, like you said, there's the truth in the middle of that.
And Jesus said, "Be wise as serpents and harmless as doves." And I think a lot of times, Christians think that we've got to be these pushovers who, just take conflict on the nose, and that's not the case. Have some wisdom about things. People are people. They're gonna lift you up in 1 minute and crucify you in the next. That's gonna happen. And also, somebody told me this, because I try, and my normal default is to try to get along with people. But Jesus never said, "Blessed are the peacekeepers." He said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." And so sometimes to get to peace, you've got to start a war and then make peace from the war.
Oh, well, that's good.
So, conflict is not a bad thing. It's I think conflict is a sign of health. If you're in a marriage and there's not conflict, something's wrong. Somebody's getting run over and somebody's unhappy. So I think conflict is a healthy sign for any organization and any relationship. Conflict isn't the problem, it's how we deal with it that it can be debilitating. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
That's good.
It does. Is there any Bible character every time you read it? I'm not talking necessarily about verses in the Bible that they wrote, but when you read this character in the Bible, is there one that you relate to it? That say, okay, this guy, he thinks like me, or he...
Jesus. No, just kidding.
I am the way, the truth, and the life.
You can edit that part out, right?
Definitely not.
Not going to happen.
I love Paul. Paul was effectively a lawyer in his day. He was educated in the law above everybody, and he gives it all up. I mean, this guy was set for life. He had, he said, I was like the Pharisee of Pharisees, or I was a lawyer of lawyers. And he gives it all up to do this crazy, he's going to tour the world talking about this dude who died. And I mean, I absolutely love Paul. He's radical, and you talk about somebody who didn't mind conflict, as well. So Paul's my guy. I love Paul.
Yeah, and he basically, it's funny about Paul because he was trained to be a teacher of the law, and he was the perfect Jew or Hebrew, whatever.
Right.
And then the Lord sent him to the Gentiles.
Yeah.
And every time he wants to try to do something with the Jews, he gets rejected.
Right.
And he bounced back to the Gentiles and churches all over the place.
Yeah.
So I've always found that fascinating about him. And talking about calling, because that's one thing that you talk a lot about, right? You talk about, you being called.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about the fellowship or Renaissance
The
Fellowship.
Renaissance Fellowship?
Yeah.
So I guess to understand the Renaissance Fellowship and what we're doing there and training potential pastors, maybe let's back up and talk a little more about who God has called me to be. One of the things that God has laid on my heart is this idea that, and even in my church, I'm not the only preacher. I'm not the only pastor. Discipleship on a micro level is I've got to copy myself into other people. If I tell my leaders all the time, if I get hit by a bus tomorrow and this church falls apart, I have failed as your leader. The hit by the bus principle. And so on a micro level, I've got to be copying myself into other people. And I feel like as a leader, I do a pretty good job of that. We've got 7 pastors in our church. I've baptized 5 of them. And so that's great. And so one of the guys that I baptized, his name is Dustin. He's a pastor in our church. About 3 years ago, he is from Lexington, and he wanted to start a food bank in Lexington, his hometown. And he comes to me and says, can we do this? And I'm like, yeah, well, our food bank is one of the major ministries of our church, and so we do that. And he goes out and he's feeding. He goes out once a month and just goes to the public library parking lot, and he's feeding 100 people every time he goes out, and that's cool, right? I mean, it's always good to feed people, but what we noticed is like 20 or 25 middle class people started showing up to help Dustin feed these people, which is not surprising. I mean, sort of that millennial mindset is, I want to love people. I think that's a great thing. Millennials get a big knock, but I think that's a great thing about millennials is they really do generally have this want to love people. Yeah. And so they may not want Jesus, but they want to love people. And I'm looking at this and looking at what's happening, and I told Dustin, dude, we should start a church, right here. Take these 25 people, let's turn them into a team and make that happen. And so we over the course of the next 2 years, we build that team up. Our church invests a group of people into the effort as well. And about 15 months ago, we started a church in Lexington, just to see what would happen. And so the idea is on a macro level, on a micro level, people are called to reproduce. But I think on a macro level, churches are called to reproduce. And so that's sort of us copying ourselves into another church. Mm-hmm. I'd started a church before. That was hard. Starting a second church was even harder. Like I was telling somebody yesterday, 2018 was hands down the hardest year of my life. Just the ridiculous attacks that came. I could tell you things that would make your skin crawl. Like I had 2 different people on the same day who don't even know each other and really don't know me call me up and tell them, the Lord told me to tell you, you're being actively cursed by witches. Like, on the same day. And I'm like, well, that makes sense, Yeah. And so it was a hard year, and copying ourselves into this church in Lexington sucked the wind out of our main campus in Jamestown, where we are. It sucked. It's like you give, like I think I told Randall before, it's like we gave birth to a kid. When you have a baby, for the next year, it's like you're being tortured by this little terrorist, and so and you don't sleep, and just when you get this kid to a place where he's asleep, he starts to crawl, and then there's a whole nother level of torture because he's into everything,
Yeah.
And so we copied ourselves into this other church, and it's great, yay that we're doing that, but it sucked out our mid-tier level of leadership in our main church and created this leadership vacuum. And we didn't lose people, but we lost the interest of our people at our main campus. Their passion for what God was doing in our church, it dwindled. And so, it was like our attendance dropped 50% in that year at our main campus. Now we added 100 people to our church in Lexington, awesome. But, our main campus, the one that pays the bills,
Lost momentum.
And and so we're still trying to get that back, honestly. And I think we're getting at a good place. The Lord showed me, and it's a learning process because we want to do this again.
Yeah.
I don't know why we want to do this again, but we want to do this again. And so I made mistakes. I didn't structure leadership the right way, and so so you ask about the fellowship. I realized if I'm going to do this again, I'm not going to do it this way. I'm not going to do this I'm not going to build one church at the expense of almost killing another church. You can take a little bit of a hit, but not like that. So, I brought together this group of pastors, including Pastor Randall, and with this idea of let's build a pipeline of people who want to be lead pastors or campus pastors.
Who feel called.
To do that, yeah.
But are stuck in a job somewhere.
Right. And, specifically people in the corporate world who were stuck like me. Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. Yeah, who want more, feel like there's more. And, these are super talented people who the ministry needs. We need more talented people, but because people get pigeonholed into, I've got to go do this thing, got to go make money.
Let me jump in here real quick. And what's so exciting about the Renaissance Fellowship is that it's a very different approach to raising up church planters. I've been a part of the North Carolina Assemblies of God lead team in church planting. We've planted over 100 churches. That model has been very successful. And what we did, we said, here's our leader, Jim Kelly, here's our infrastructure, come to us if you want to plant a church, and we will approve you or not approve you. What Jason has come up with is very brilliant. It's actually very different from that. It's reaching out through marketing, a lot of social media kind of marketing, to discover people who do have a call from the Lord, but have no idea what to do with it or where to go or who to connect to. And so Jason's he's put the flag up and said, "Wait, here I am."
Right.
And they've come out of the woodwork. It's a really exciting model. And I'm excited to be a part of it because do you understand the difference? Instead of saying, hey, church planter, if you want to plant a church, come to us. Mm-hmm. We're taking basically the message or the opportunity out there to them. So it's very, very different. And I love it. I love it. In fact, Jim Kelly is considering adopting this model.
Jim's going to be with us this Thursday
yep.
evening and the next couple of Thursday evenings talking to our folks about team building. Mm-hmm. The other thing that as we're bringing these folks in, is we had 25 people apply to the program, and we were very clear that we want people who don't just feel called to ministry, but they have the character for ministry as well. Because one of the worst things we can do is to let somebody without the character for ministry or the endurance for ministry. You know how it is. Ministry is hard. And so we were really intentional about being selective. So we ended up letting 6 people in to the program.
Out of 25.
Out of 25, right.
Where, if I can ask you a couple of questions, because that was going to be my number one, how many do you have applying now? But where are they Where do they seem to come from? Is there any kind of pattern or general area?
The 25 people. So we did something creative and did a sponsored social media campaign to find these people. And basically videos of, hey, if you feel called, if you feel like something's missing in your life, click here, apply here. So they filled out an initial application. Those 25 people were from all over the place. Within our church, I think only 2 of them were from within our church at that time. Then I made them fill out a 3-hour application, and that weeded them down from, it's a difference between filling out a 30-minute application and a 3-hour. Again, we're looking for people who want this, like not people who are barely in, but who want to be all in. And we got probably, I would say 10 or 11 applications from that. And then we made them go through a round of interviews, which was a whole day of interviews. And from those 10 or 11 who filled out applications, we asked the 6 that we eventually let in to come to the day of interviews. Actually, I asked 7. And on the eve of an interview, we had one of our applicants say, no, this is too much for me. And so we lost one on the night before the interviews. And so we ended up with 6, 2 of which were in my church originally. And frankly, I had been overlooking. I told Randall, I had no clue they had the talent level that they have. And I feel guilty about that. They've been in my church since the beginning and for 11 years, and they've just sort of been, mid-level volunteer. And, we let them in. And then the other 4 that we let in were out from outside of our church, and they are just part of the program. And a couple of them have started coming to our church as a result of it. That's not the goal. The goal is not to build my church with this. The goal was to start churches with this. And so, a couple of them don't go to our church. And so, that's where they came from.
Talk to us a little bit about the numbers, Jason, that when we were creating the Renaissance Fellowship, the numbers you saw in the triad compared to the number of churches and the need for new churches, really the need for a move of God.
Yeah. So if I strongly believe that revival is coming to the triad, I feel that there is something brewing here.
That's stirring here in the gathering with Pastor Wayne.
Yeah, I feel that we're going to see. I received a prophetic word that a couple of years ago from a pastor of a mega church in Tennessee, and he called me up and he said, "The Lord told me to tell you that what's coming from the triangle," he said, he said, he didn't know nothing about us. He said, "I just saw a triangle." Wow. And he called me up and he said, "I saw this wave beginning in the triangle and heading west." And he said that what is going to happen in the triad is going to be on the news. It's going to be sort of a great awakening type of ground zero. And he said it's going to be on the news. People are going to want to know what's happening in the triad. So I strongly believe revival's coming. We can talk more about that later if you want to answer your question. Do we have enough chairs for them? In our churches. And so I just did the math on, and so one of my churches is in the city of High Point. I just did the math on if we want there to be enough seats in churches for 51% of the people in High Point to even have a seat in a church, right? So we want to have seats for them. Then we would need to start, I think, around 350 churches of 100 people.
And that's just in High Point?
That's just the city of High Point. And so, if you stretch those numbers out across the triad, Winston-Salem, Greensboro, and High Point, the numbers are between 700 and 800 new churches of 100 people just to have enough chairs for 51%. Now, why 51%?
On top of the churches already existing.
On top of the churches already existing. And which, when you think about that, our churches are fighting over the same 10% of people. We're fighting stupid fights over 10% of people who are frankly just consumers and big babies. And
Amen. I'm in the amen corner.
Yeah, and so why are we doing that? From a business standpoint, Wayne, that's dumb, right? You've got a 90% unsaturated market, and the church is this entity that Jesus said the gates of hell would not prevail against, and we're waiting on our 10% to show up, hoping that we get the other church's people, and jealous of the other church's success. Somebody told me recently when Jesus said the gates of hell will not prevail, that's not like we're waiting on hell to attack our gates. That's an offensive verse that we should be on the offense attacking the gates of hell. We need a massive number of churches to be planted. And I think that there's creativity here. I don't know what it looks like in the triad, spitballing. Maybe we need an amphitheater, or amphitheaters, because buildings are expensive, but I think that there are creative solutions.
Pastor Wayne's got the solution for that.
Maybe we need a tent.
Hey, yes, sir. I'll buy me on that. Yes, sir.
Seriously.
Yeah, I know he does. I've seen this. I've seen the drawings on this thing. So,
but new, not old.
Right.
It's a new take.
And that's one of the things I wanted to ask you, because we're talking about numbers, and I've got 28 years here now in this area. And Lord knows we would have left some years ago and went to the beach. And Pastor Randall would have been right behind us if the Lord would have let him go.
You're getting closer and closer to that goal all the time.
But God called us here.
Right.
And even after we left our last pastorate, we couldn't leave here because of what God years ago had birthed in my spirit of what he was doing in this region. Now, this goes back 20-some years for me, and that word has been the same, and the passion is still the same.
Right.
It has nothing to do with position, has nothing to do with role that you may be in.
Yep.
It's a call that God gives to people that he brings into a geographical area.
Right.
When he is ready to do something off the chart. For the kingdom.
Wow.
And that's what several of us, and now I'm hearing a resurgence of a word that God was speaking. You'll remember back when the Brownsville revival was going so strong in the 90s. And for 5 years, 5 million people coming through that down in Pensacola. And 500,000 getting saved. Well, Dr. Cho at that time was very popular, everyone listening to what he was saying and doing and all. He was praying and had a vision, and you probably remember, Randall, hearing this, of the fire that started in that little fishing village down in Florida. He was praying over the map of the United States, and on the eastern seaboard, he saw that fire begin to come up the eastern seaboard. And a blaze began burning here in our region.
Wow.
And when I heard that, something resonated in my spirit. And all these years later, I haven't been able to get away from that. So I know there's something powerful. It seems like lately in the prophetic realm that wherever I've personally been, there's been people that don't know you, like you're talking about. They call you out and, hey, God is speaking this over you. God is saying this about the area and the ministry. And then you start meeting other people like yourself and like you that God gave you that word on the beach at the Outer Banks.
Right.
And you thought he was calling you to the Outer Banks, called you to High Point instead. And that experience with the gentleman that got saved there that evening, I mean, just a powerful call. Because over the years, God has brought people together for our region for something that I believe we're about to see happen. And what I began seeing personally is that he is calling people out of unique areas. You were in the business realm, in the legal profession. He called you out of that to do this. You're still working within the legal profession. And other pastors like you, Randall, you've been a pastor on staff of a large church and then pastoring for many years full time, now working some in the secular field and real estate. I had been a full-time pastor for a number of years, and God opened up the business world for me, and he's pulling people together out of different areas and putting us in places that we never thought we would be, which is astounding to me.
Right.
But one of the things that is happening, just like you're doing with the fellowship in training pastors, is I see him creating and generating resources and out-of-the-box type of methods that break our old traditions, that we can finally begin to reach a generation that is ready for what God's getting ready to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Can I? So
what's so exciting about Jason is you're sitting here at the table, Pastor Wayne, with a front runner. This dude is on the cutting edge, and he is reaching the culture. So it's so exciting to see that. God raising up fresh, strong leaders who get it, and they're going after the culture out there who's dying to hear it.
Yeah.
You know?
That's not going to respond to what happened 15, 20 years ago with us.
No, yeah.
It is a new out-of-the-box method.
Can I say something to? I love what you just said. Can I say something to the leaders who are out there who may be listening, and they feel like, you know, I can be a part of this. I have leadership inside of me. Is one of the things I've learned is that anytime somebody takes a step towards leadership, hell is going to fight like hell.
Absolutely.
To keep you from doing that. You know, I like to say this: when heaven sings an opera over you, hell will sing or throw a concert to distract you, you know? And I can't tell you the number of times I've seen people who are bright and maybe even in the corporate world take a step into ministry, and then all of a sudden, and I almost tell them this every time, hey, you're getting ready to do this, something's going to come to distract you. They get a job offer out of state or you know, something like that. It's the distraction. But it's what we've been talking about. It's this pull to what the world tells you got to be doing with your talent, right? The world tells you this is success, and so, or that this is the way I've got to go. And you know, I mean, I think there are a lot of really good pastors in the triad who are getting pulled away from the triad to go to a bigger church, you know. And I had somebody, I had somebody tell me recently. They told me, don't you dare go to a bigger church. Don't you dare leave the triad. They said, you can do what every other pastor does and leave, and do what everybody else does, or you can stay here and see what has never been seen. And so to the talented people out there, I would say the same thing. You could do what everybody else is doing, or you could heed your calling and see what's never been seen. Because I'm telling you, something is coming, and we've never seen anything like it. You know, it's revival. You know, I mean, we talk about, let's not be so churchy, but let's just call it what it is. It's revival. And I think a lot of times,
I'm for that.
I think, but do we even know what revival is? Let's talk about what revival really is. You know, so I've done a lot of study of like the great awakenings in our culture. And so great awakenings happen in our culture every 50 to 60 years. And so the last one being the Jesus movement of the late 60s and early 70s. That's 50 years ago, y'all. Mm-hmm. It's time. But when revival hits, I think, especially in our circle of more Pentecostal charismatic type churches, we think revival is a good church service. That's not revival. That's fake revival. You know, revival is a region being completely shifted. You know, so what does that look like in the triad? What does revival look like in the triad? I think it may start with powerful church services because, you know, that's the engine that may turn it. But I think real revival in the triad means when somebody comes into the triad, they feel different. Something's different about this place. You know, you've been to holy places and you feel it, right? Mm-hmm. Yes. What if in the triad, the divorce rate dropped and it was markedly different than the rest of the country? What if in the triad is the second hungriest region in the country? Like our hunger problem, that's stupid. Why is that?
The city of Winston-Salem, do you know the stats on that for children that are hungry?
What are they?
I don't remember what the percentage is, but it's like in the top 10 of the nation.
Yeah, and I know where we are in High Point. We've been deemed the second hungriest place in the country.
Yeah, This is a shame with all the resources all around us.
But when revival comes, what if I think that's a setup, so that when revival comes, people can say, look what the Lord has done. We've gone from the second hungriest region in the country to being one of the most prosperous regions in the country.
So you're speaking to that spirit of poverty that has hovered and controlled over this region, that when true revival comes, you begin to see the breaking down of that.
It breaks. So, in prior Great Awakenings, oh my God, the Great Awakening of the 1850s it started in New York City. And when it happened, they called it the Marketplace Revival because it was centered around lunchtime. In the city of New York, people would go and pray. And they would get so carried away in their prayer services that it would shut the businesses down in New York City in the 1850s. They called it the Marketplace Revival. It did not begin in the church. It began through the prayer of professionals. Yeah. And then it spread like wildfire to Chicago and out west.
Right.
That's revival.
Wow. Yeah.
That's, let's not limit God to having good church services on Sunday morning. Let's talk about a city-shifting, region-shifting revival.
Something that you said earlier kind of caught my attention. You said that a bunch of millennials came in and started to help out with the thing you guys were doing.
Yeah.
I feel like, because I personally struggle with that generation. I'm not a millennial. I'm a Gen X, but... and all the people my age struggle.
I thought you were a baby boomer.
Sometimes I feel like. But I feel like some of the stuff you're saying is going to require for people like you or like you guys to learn how to mold or how to see that talent in that new expression of what can a revival be. Because, what's a revival? Everybody thinks about the church fill up, the tent, whatever. We feel about the 90s, 80s, the Bronzeville, the Crusades, all this stuff. But nobody's thinking about, because we know that millennials are a very social conscious generation. They think about the environment, they think about the others, is very social conscience with society, something that maybe our generation didn't have that. So will require maybe a new vision of how to use that and turn it into a new expression of the gospel. Because this generation is not connecting to the version of the gospel that we have today.
I've heard that called with reach. Come reach a group of people with us. Come help us.
Right.
So it's called with reach. When you do missional type ministry in the community, like a food pantry, or when we first started Hope, we would go out and do all kinds of outreach projects, and we always invited folks to come, and they would. So yeah, it can become a very powerful model.
Yeah, I think outreach is key to mobilizing millennials. Our most volunteered ministry in our church by far is our food bank. Like our food bank is sucking away all our volunteers from the more traditional church ministries. So I think that's important. I also think so. I'm right in the middle of Gen X and millennial. Like I'm right at the cutoff myself. So I get both generations. But I know about millennials, they are nonconformists. I got a lawyer who I just hired for my law firm, 26 years old, and he's in the office 20 hours a week. He's mobile. They're a very mobile generation. They've got the attention span of a gnat, and so this Twitter ruined everything, right?
Yeah. I've got a few of those.
And so we're seeing this infiltrate our traditional Sunday gatherings. The statistics are the committed churchgoer, comes to church 1.8 times a month.
Right.
And so, look at what we've done in, to our church programming is, when I was growing up, we were in church 4 times a week,
Yeah.
And then we canceled the Sunday night service, which I was all for. And then Wednesday night, and we shifted towards small groups, and that's great. But what we're seeing in this generation is they're not coming to church. They do not view the Sunday experience as critical.
Right.
And I wonder if it's because we're not creating enough opportunities for them. And people are going to hate me saying this, but I think that we're going to have to be creative in the different ways we engage them. We have to think mobile. And I don't just mean on their phones, but I mean, I've seen some churches experimenting in other cities with duplicating their Sunday service on Thursday nights. And they're packing it out. And they're bringing in, just things like that. I think,
Vintage Church does like a Monday night.
I was about to say that Vintage right here in town with us, Matt, a young pastor, has done a dynamic job. He took his Sunday morning service because he has so many people having to work on Sundays.
Right.
Opened up Monday night, and in town, I hear reports constantly from people going
that's kind of
about how grateful
that's kind of
they
brilliant
are.
Because when you think about it, Sunday has become a very busy day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There used to be never be ball games on Sunday for kids, but Monday evenings, that's kind of genius. I have to give some thought to that. So what we the old farts can do is we can get upset because they're not coming to our Sunday services like they need to, or we can go out and reach them where they are.
He's got in a town like this, he's got 300-400 people there every Monday night, and it's phenomenal.
In Randleman.
In Randleman. I mean,
that's amazing. That's a miracle.
Yeah, it's a very young church.
So, and they're a young church. So you hear what he's saying is that a guy was creative in reaching them, and he's seeing a miracle. And so I think to answer your question, we got to be willing to do stuff like that. Think outside the box to reach these folks.
Something that I think with millennials, they are not impressed by mega churches. They actually rather not go to a mega church because they like community. They like exactly. So that's something, because I know I grew up with many different leaders, and the goal was a new building, a new facility. And actually, I was part of a big church in my home country, because back then in the 90s, that was the big deal. And I believe that was God. But this is a new generation. And most millennials that I talk with, I realize there's a lot of the values that we have in my generation are not necessarily the same for them. So for them to see a 3,000 people church, for them, it's not a big deal. It's not.
So here's my prediction. I think the age of the mega church is over. I think that there will always be a few large churches, the elevation churches of the world, and they're doing a great thing. Yeah. But I think we've got to be careful in trying to imitate them, because really, as large as a church like Elevation Church is, they're the fingernail of the body of Christ. And we're trying, I think a lot of us fall into the trap of trying to discern for the body based on what the fingernail is doing. And I really feel that we're going to see a move back towards the intimate. In planning churches, I was telling somebody the other day, a lot of church planning models, success is reaching 1,000 people. Well, that's dumb. How many churches are there of 1,000? What percentage of churches are 1,000 people? The average church in America is about 75 people. Yeah. That's success. Yeah. And so, but we're discouraging, this makes me mad, we're discouraging all these church planners by telling them they've not reached success because they're not a church of 1,000 people. When look, you got 120 people coming to your place, you are successful. You have connected believers.
Well, they're being told you're not even a church until you have 300 people.
Right.
Wow.
Never mind what the Bible says about 2 or 3.
Think about this, Jason. When the Apostle Paul would go into a community, say, Ephesus or Philippi, and he would just start talking to people about Jesus. Some scholars say that within 2 to 3 years, the movement of Christianity would be as large as 50,000 people. From the day Paul started, within 3 years, he's reached 50,000 people. None of that happened, though, in a big building.
Nope.
None of it.
Wow. He was a tent maker.
There it is. There it is. It was house churches.
Yeah, it was.
Smaller segments, smaller cells. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I agree with you. I mean, I think God's doing something in me. He's doing something in our culture too, with the whole churchianity of America.
Wow.
That's a statement to itself. Of what is that? It was like we've created this industry. We've created this thing. And I'm just not sure that that's really what God ever had in mind.
Here's a great book for you. Francis Chan's book, Letters to the Church, is an amazing book on that very thing.
Yeah.
Be sure you're in a good mood before you read Francis Chan, because you ever read one of his books, you'll want to, retire or something, but it's a great book.
Yeah.
Look at how we have turned the body of Christ into this consumer-based thing. So, yeah.
Interesting.
It kind of plays into what you're doing also with the fellowship, because what if God's plan for this region is not 10 churches with 1,000 members each, but maybe 10,000 churches with 100.
Yeah.
Because then God have the opportunity. And I can see, like, once again, with the millennial generation, I can see them jumping into that. I can see them, because they're about the community, about new expression of church. I mean, I don't know what you guys think. I know what Randall thinks about this, but just the fact that you got somebody like Kanye West coming and becoming a Christian, and then he has these Sunday services, and it's so creative, so different, so artistic. It's like, really doesn't look like my church service, than any church service that I've ever been. But I wonder how that revival that we are talking about is going to look like. I wonder if it's really going to look like what we've seen before. If we know something about God, it might not. Mm-hmm. So that will require leadership that is willing not only to open the doors for yes, you can plant the church, but also that new expression of what the gospel is going to look in the future for this new generation that is not impressed by a big building or a big TV show, whatever that is. They're just hungry for something new and something that looks different.
Yeah, and that's exciting.
Yeah,
I mean, 100 churches.
I think it was
people.
I think it was Andy Stanley in his latest book. He talks about, I think it's called Irresistible. He talks about how we have built a model of church, 21st century. What the first century church had was no model. It was a movement. I mean, Jesus was just here. He was here last week, and he's here. He's now here, and the Holy Spirit is here. And it spread like fire. It was a movement. And what we've done is taken a movement and turned it into some kind of model and stifled it, So
this revival that we all are convinced is coming to our region may not look like anything that we would predict.
Right.
So can we look for the right kind of results rather than saying that there's going to be this many? We've been at this for quite a few years, and every new plan we develop has the goals, and I am a very goal-oriented person, but our goals are always, we're going to plant this many churches, we're going to reach this many people, we're going to baptize this many, we're going to give this much to missions, we're going to do all these things. And there are a lot of people that have gotten bypassed with all of our goal seeking. I'm seeing for several years now, I've not been in the full-time pastorate position. And so I've gotten to meet people.
God's given you a different pulpit.
A different pulpit. And I'm probably ministering to more people than I ever had.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
at the same time, I'm meeting people.
And people who would never darken the door of a church.
Never, and would never talk to me as a pastor.
Right.
Now I'm building relationships, I'm getting to know people. And one of the things I'm finding that is a surprise to me, and I know that Tien can edit this if he wants to.
No.
Not a chance.
You guys might. But to my surprise, there are a lot of saved people that are not in our churches, that are disenfranchised, yet they still love God. They still live for God. Now, as a pastor, I had a hard time with that concept because I could rattle off all of our favorite scriptures of, well, if you're a follower, if you're a true believer, you're going to do these things. And obviously, where are you sending your tithe money?
Right.
So we have boxed in all these things, but I genuinely believe that there are a lot of people out there that will go to heaven, that love God, that for whatever reasons, they are not in that plan that we all develop and look at as this is revival happening. One of the things I'd like to see happen is a genuine stirring of the Spirit of God, that the marketplace revivals you're talking about and the different environments that are unconventional. We begin to see people with a bold testimony of Christ that are reaching people, and something is stirring. I have found pockets of believers without what we would call a genuine pastor and leader, but are larger than some of the churches that we have. And they've become their own church in someone's house or from house to house or wherever they're meeting at. There are so many things happening already that God is doing that I think too often as church leaders, we get so out of step and out of tune with what God is doing that God just bypasses us because he's going to reach this world no matter what.
Right.
So that's just a thought. And like I said, you might want to edit some of that, but that's a little bit radical for some church leaders. But this is one of the things that I want to see God do here in our region. I want to break that back of denominationalism, that religious spirit that has built our fences in the original intent, it's been said many times, to keep us safe, but in so doing, we build them too small and we've kept the world out. Because they don't, like you're saying about the millennials or nonconformists, they're not going to conform to our little pattern and box that we have set up.
Mm-hmm. So, just to start to wrap up this, there's people right now that are in that same place, Christians, people that they know they have that call, they're maybe in a career, they might be doing something, and I understand. I'm a full-time musician in the ministry, but I grew up in a household where I got the voice of my mom saying, well, if you're going to be a musician, you're going to starve. And eventually I'm not starving, you know. It's quite evident. But I understand the struggle of people that know they have a calling in life, and you have to take the risk of answering that call. So, you went through that because you were part of this successful law firm. You became a very young partner, and that's huge. What do you tell somebody who is in a profession or career or in a place similar to you? What would you recommend, or what would you tell that person?
I would say first, if you are called, find a way to take one step towards the call.
Okay.
You know, that it shifts you back into balance. If you're not doing your calling, if you're not at least moving in that direction, you know, there's a David was called to be the king as a teenager, but he didn't become the king for another probably 40 years.
Yeah, that's true.
But he was always moving towards it, right?
True.
And so I think a lot of times with calling, we think that today is the day. So I would first say, take a step. One of the things I like to say is, if you take a step towards God, God will take 1,000 steps to get to you. So just take a step, right? I would also say there's a difference between faith and stupidity as well. So I was 29 when we started the core team for our church, but I did not step away from the practice of law and quit my job as a partner until I was 34.
And let me back up there, and Tian, I would say to anybody that's thinking about, or sensing a call in their life, get connected to a life-giving church.
Yeah.
That's what Jason did. He connected with us. I immediately saw leadership in him. We put him in the youth pastor role. So he was able to try out some of his giftings. He was able to kind of walk in that in a supervised environment. And he did a fabulous thing, man. I mean, his youth group was as big as our church. You know what I'm saying? And he was also able to grow as a leader. Yeah. And that's when he launched out to take the next step of starting his church.
So what you just said, I've told people in our fellowship, because there is this, just people want to be the lead pastor. I mean, I think any kind of person with, a calling to pastor, they want to do it today, And so I've had 2 conversations this week where I've said, you don't jump into the deep end of the pool. No. Like I said, there's a difference between faith and stupidity, and, being a lead pastor brings with it. I didn't appreciate this when I worked for Randall. I've told him this, is you don't understand the level of attack that a lead pastor is under. Yeah. See my 2018, for example, Right. And so you don't jump into that, you wade into that, Right, and so I would say, wade into it. There's a difference between faith and stupidity. Let's be real. The big faith question is financials. I laid my fleece out to God. It's like, okay, God, I know I'm gonna have to take a big old pay cut to, quit my job as a lawyer, but, there's got to be some kind of paycheck on the other side of this thing, And so I laid a fleece out, because again, I think there's wisdom in faith. I think a lot of times we throw wisdom out because it was his faith, but wisdom is you've got to view faith with wisdom. And I put my fleece out and I said, okay, God, if the church financials are like this for 6 months in a row, they're at this level, I'll do it. And I'm like, it'll never be that. And so I'm like, I'm safe. And then 3 months go by and it was that. I'm like, oh crap, I'm going to have to. And so by the end of the 6th month, it was like, I'm going to have to do this. And so I did the hardest thing I've ever done. And I quit my job as a lawyer. I was, I think 33, 34, I think, in there. I was making ridiculous money for a 34-year-old should not make the amount of money I was making, because you don't know what to do with it. And so I was like, okay, well, we've made this 6 months in a row, quit my job. And the next month, we have our lowest giving month ever as a church. And so I'm like, very funny, God. Very funny. Very funny. But so, have some wisdom in what you're doing. I will tell you this, though, is that in that next year, my law firm that I'd worked for called me twice, telling me that in the year before they had computed my salary wrong, or that I had not gotten a bonus check, and told me twice to come pick up 5-figure checks. Twice. Wow. In the year after I left practicing law, between my meager preacher salary and those missed checks, I made almost to the penny the exact same amount of money I made the year before.
Wow.
So God will always take care of you. If God's got a vision for your life, what God does, whatever God's vision is for your life, it will be funded. Yeah. Every time, but he's waiting on you to take a step. So, and so, at the end of that year, my wife, she becomes pregnant with our 3rd child and says, I want to stay home with the baby. And I'm like, I make preacher money now. You can't do, you gotta work. Somebody's got to support my lifestyle. And
I think you should write a book called Preacher Money.
And she said, teach me how to do real estate closings, because that's, I'd done a little bit of that when I first started practicing law. She said, teach me how to do real estate closings. And I'm like, that's cool. If you'll do 2 or 3 a month, I'll go do the closings. I'll spend 5 hours a week sort of supervising you, but do 2 or 3 a month and we can make ends meet. And she's like, great. And so we start this thing, and God's hand was on it. And this month we're doing 60 closings.
Wow.
And we've got 7 employees who work, I guess for me, but really for my wife, because she runs the thing. And I have never had a year where I made less money than I was making as a practicing lawyer. In fact, I'm making at least double that now, and not to brag on me, but to brag on God. I'm telling you, God will take care of you if you step out in faith every single time. So step out.